Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online. Today is Wednesday, January 22nd, 2025. We're 48 hours into the Trump administration, and I am Drew Clark, CEO of Broadband Breakfast. Happy to welcome you to another of our weekly editions of Broadband Breakfast Live Online. This program we've been doing for nearly 5 years, since the start of the pandemic. Every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time. Even though we are Broadband Breakfast, we sometimes have a late breakfast here on the East Coast, but it's actually quite early if you're in Alaska or Hawaii. And we thank you, those who do come to our program from Alaska and Hawaii, because we certainly have you and appreciate you. We care about better broadband, better lives here at Broadband Breakfast. We're a news and events community around these topics, ensuring high-speed access for everyone in the country, and also that we know how to use it and take advantage of it. And we often cover topics that are related to infrastructure, to broadband infrastructure, the impact it has, the policy implications, even sometimes issues of energy and data centers have come into the mix, and we've certainly been covering those a lot in the last 48 hours. Today, we're going to talk about the CHIPS Act, which is another of these topics that has sort of been on the, I wouldn't say periphery, but it hasn't been the dead center, but it is very, very connected to the initiatives that we've seen over the last 5-6 years on ensuring and onshoring of high-tech capacity in the United States. And it is worth noting, last week we had our Broadband Breakfast Live Online about TikTok, right? Again, very much in the news. The week before, we had a session where we assessed the Biden administration's infrastructure legacy. Now that we're in the Trump administration, we do think it's appropriate to talk about the state of the CHIPS Act. And next week, we'll be talking about the Little Tech Agenda and its impact. So we try to stay topical, on point, and we're very excited as well for upcoming conferences, in-person conferences that we'll be doing. We don't have anything to announce today, but for those of you who have recently joined or been part of Broadband Breakfast, we want you to make sure you watch the videos we had about broadband in the Trump administration about a month and a week ago. The CHIPS Act, just again, by way of very brief introduction, is one of 3 major domestic accomplishments of the Biden administration. Largely, these were in the first Congress, and not the last 2 years, but they included the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of November 2021, the CHIPS and Science Act. I believe that one was in July, either July or August of 2022, and then the Inflation Reduction Act, which, despite its name, was really more focused on energy and green energy. And that's the one that the Trump administration has really put under the microscope. There's been rafts of executive orders in the last 48 hours that touch upon or address the Inflation Reduction Act, and trying to curb anything that would go out that is in support of it. Inflation Reduction Act was much more partisan than either the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act or the CHIPS and Science Act. And so that's, again, what we're going to focus on today. The CHIPS and Science Act, what was it? How will it fare in this Congress and this administration? What has already happened in its implementation thus far in the 2.5 years that it's been around? Before I introduce our panelists, I do want to thank the sponsors of Broadband Breakfast that enable us to do this free Broadband Breakfast Live Online programming we've been doing for nearly 5 years. These sponsors include Utopia Fiber, Comcast, Ookla, Wesco, Coos Systems, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance's Community Broadband Networks Initiative, the California Emerging Technology Fund, G-Fiber, Broadband Now, CostQuest, NCTA, the Internet and Television Association, Gaia, NextNav, and Nokia. And we're happy to welcome Nokia as a sponsor. Welcome back. We're extremely excited to get Nokia's perspectives on this issue of Chips and Science Act, as well as the broader Buy America initiatives that, again, have been sort of percolating out there for many years. I certainly wouldn't describe that as partisan in any degree. But again, let's hear how this will be impacted by the administration we're now in. So with that, let me go ahead and turn to our panelists. Now, it looks as though we're still having some trouble getting. Oh, no, we're not. Awesome. We got your video, Gary. I'm so excited about that. So we have three great panelists to talk us through different aspects of the Chips and Science Act. We're going to hear first from Stephen Ezell. He's Vice President of Global Innovation Policy and Director, Center for Life Sciences Innovation at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Extremely prolific foundation. I don't even know how many people you guys have over there, but you are always punching above your weight. Stephen, as the Vice President of the Global Innovation Policy there, leads a number of areas of expertise, including science and technology policy, international competitiveness, trade, and manufacturing. And he's the author of Innovating, gotta bump up my, Innovating in a Service-Driven Economy, Insights, Applications, and Practices, as well as Innovation Economics, the Race for Global Advantage. So very excited to hear just now from Steve Ezell. He'll be followed by Gary Huffbauer. Gary is a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And in that role, and I should say before that role, I can hardly say before that role, you've been there, more than 30 years, right? Since 1985. But before joining that, he was the Marcus Wallenberg Professor of International Financial Diplomacy at Georgetown University. So we're really excited. Gary Huffbauer has joined us. He's written extensively on international trade, international taxation, and economic sanctions. And then our final panelist will be, and we're sorry that we, unfortunately, for a medical appointment or something that came up unexpectedly, Brian Clark will not be joining us. But our final panelist of the three we have is Mimi Strobel. Mimi is the Senior Director for Policy and Government Relations for Nokia. She's here in Washington, D.C. And as the Senior Director of Policy and Government Relations, she works with the team covering advocacy and outreach for the United States Congress and the administration on a wide range of topics, including technology, telecommunications, innovation, emerging tech, research and development, trade, and the business and geopolitical impacts of such issues. And she has led the company Nokia's work regarding the Chips and Science Act, including your membership with the National Semiconductor Technology Center. So fabulous panelists. They will know far more than me, and we certainly welcome all of you who are joining us either on Zoom or other platforms. Please put your questions in the Q&A tab, and we'll get to as many as we can. But for now, let's turn it over to you, Stephen Ezell.
Well, Drew, thank you very much for that kind introduction and the invitation to be with you today. Well, listen, overall, I think the CHIPS Act has really been a tremendous success. From 1990 to 2020, America's share of global semiconductor manufacturing declined by 70 percentage points, from 30% down to about 12. Now, thanks to the CHIPS Act, we're on a path where by 2030, approximately 20% of the world's leading edge semiconductor logic chips, those at the sub 10 nanometer process node level, should be manufactured in the USA. Overall, so far, the CHIPS Program Office has made $33 billion in grant awards and $5.5 billion worth of loans to 31 companies across 48 projects in 23 states. The investments are catalyzing construction of 17 new semiconductor fabs in the United States. And overall, the CHIPS Act has catalyzed about $450 billion in private sector investment in America's semiconductor and electronics ecosystem. That's more investment over the last 4 years than over the past 3 decades combined. The investments are helping to support the creation of 125,000 jobs in the United States. And most importantly, the loans and the subsidies in the CHIPS Act have helped offset a 30% semiconductor manufacturing cost gap differential between the United States and East Asia. We've also made some very significant investments on the R&D side. And of course, of the $52 billion that was allocated for the CHIPS Act, we had about $39 billion for the incentives and grants and $13 billion for the R&D. Those investments so far have led to standing up, as you said, of the National Semiconductor Technology Center, public-private consortium that will serve as the focal point for the nation's semiconductor research. We've also launched the CHIPS National Advanced Packaging Manufacturing Program. Packaging refers to the ways in which the semiconductors are simple tested and packaged, and the three-dimensional complex designs to deal with the challenge of Moore's law. But this right now, America accounts for 3% of the global advanced packaging market. This center should help that. And we're also standing up a new Manufacturing USA Institute, be the 18th one, known as Smart USA, or the Semiconductor Manufacturing and Advanced Research with Twins USA. So overall, I think this has really been a phenomenal program. Now, having said that, if ITIF has a critique, it is that, frankly, it has taken far too long for this money to get dispersed. Really, almost all of it should have been released out the door by last summer. And yet now, even 15% of the total funding package is yet to be awarded. And even as late as the middle of this past September, Intel had yet to receive a single dollar of the $7.86 billion it was promised in funding. Now, as ITF has written, it does seem that the disbursement of the CHIPS incentives got bogged down in the arcane minutiae of deal terms. Now, we certainly respect everything the CHIPS Program Office did to introduce important covenants, milestone-based funding, be sure that the American taxpayer is getting value for their dollars, and enormous respect for the care, detail, and professionalism the CHIPS Program Office brought to their task. That said, Ezra Klein Everett Fox has noted that, quote, CHIPS Act funding got slowed down with the everything bagel of progressive red tape. So the grant applications in the CHIPS Act had to do things such as, quote, validate that the applicant has developed a plan for access to childcare for facility and construction workers, promote community investments, including financing or building affordable housing or providing housing vouchers. Quite frankly, these types of provisions are social engineering. They're not about restoring U.S. industrial competitiveness in advanced manufacturing. And I think this is an area that the Trump administration or Republican Congress could look at going back and stripping out some of these ancillary and unnecessary elements from these program deals. Let's tell you this, one company which received about an equal amount of funding from the US government and from a European government for their investments, told me that the length of the deal with the Commerce Department was 5 times longer than the number of pages they signed with the European deal. So, as we think about lessons learned from the CHIPS Act and how to improve it going forward, let's really strip out ancillary items and focus on US competitiveness. Where do we stand now? I think that the focus really for the next couple of years has got to be on effective execution and implementation of this program. Let's get all the money out the door. Let's see the impact it's having. And if we decide we need more, let's do it on a targeted basis, see where the gaps are after we've dispersed all the money. That said, one thing Congress should immediately do, because it is important, is to extend the 25% investment tax credit. That's going to expire on January 1st, 2027. This is the flat credit for these investments in semiconductor manufacturing. We should clearly extend that at least through the end of this decade. Talking with the companies from the very beginning, they've told me, Steve, we don't know what kind of package of loans or incentives we'll get from the CHIPS Program Office. We may or may not get money, but we do know with that investment tax credit that we get 25% the day we put the shovel in the ground. So that's important. Let's extend that, and let's continue to build on restoring American global leadership in this critical sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Great introduction. We look forward to hearing now from Gary Huffbauer. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Drew. Stephen just gave a terrific overview of the CHIPS Act. I'm with a think tank called the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and we did a fairly lengthy report on the CHIPS Act. We call it a preliminary report because, as Stephen has pointed out, a lot of the construction remains to be done. It's on our website, the Peterson Institute for International Economics website. So if you want to, if you have time to read it or read the summary of it, please click on that. Let me add a few nuances and comments to what Stephen has said. First of all, the big part of the subsidy program is not the grants and loans given by the Department of Commerce. Together, it's about 39 billion of grants and about 11 billion in subsidy value terms of loans, maybe about 50 billion. But the investment tax credit, which Stephen mentioned right at the last of his comments, will probably come up to about 100 billion. And the difference in the administration between the investment tax credit and the grants is quite important. The grants and the loans, they have about 150 people in the Commerce Department who evaluate proposals, decide whether they are a contribution to the national security, whether the companies are viable, on and on. For the investment tax credit, if the firm invests in semiconductor equipment, it gets the credit, 25%. So it's, much simpler and more certain. In terms of the objectives of the Act, the principal objective was, as Stephen again has emphasized, to build manufacturing plant in the United States to make semiconductors, principally these so-called foundries, which, the big ones, excuse me, cost as much as 20 billion. So they're really big investments. And that's the, the core of the effort of the CHIPS Act to build foundries in the United States, which make advanced memory and advanced logic chips, as opposed to importing them principally from East Asia. That would be Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. The U.S. chips industry has really three parts. First of all, research and development, illuminated by firms like NVIDIA, Broadcom, Nokia, I would say, who design these chips, very complicated design. And then the manufacturing of the chips, and thirdly, the packaging of them. And that third part may sound simple, but it's not. It's there's a testing, assembly, packaging called ATP, which is a big part of the chips process. The United States firms headquartered in the United States are absolutely dominant in research and designing of chips. And the revenues of US-based firms are about half the world total. So it's not that our firms are weak, not at all. The whole purpose of the CHIPS Act was to increase manufacturing activity in the US because many of these firms, they manufacture by themselves or jointly with another firm abroad. So the big success of the CHIPS Act had been to move this manufacturing investment to the US. And it succeeded. About half of world investment in manufacturing in this industry in the last couple of years has been in the US, which is a huge increase over what happened previously, as Stephen said. Let me just offer, interest of time, just a few comments on where we think, my colleagues and I think the CHIPS Act ought to focus if it's renewed in the future. First of all, the United States, though we're tremendously successful as in research, we do not give very good research incentives to companies, this industry and other industries. We're very stingy on that compared to Europe, Japan, other countries. And our view is that more of the incentives going to this industry should be on the research end rather than the manufacturing end. And in particular, this 25% investment tax credit should be applied to research as well. So that's one point. Another point is that the US probably ought to consider more incentives for inventory and stockpiling of chips in the US. The shortages during the pandemic were a big reason for the CHIPS Act, and the stockpiling was not there, and there could be incentives for that. So that's another point we would make going forward. As Stephen said, the investment tax credit, it expires on December 31st, 2026. Unless a plan to start it then, no more credit. That will probably need to be extended. Maybe the grants don't need to be extended or renewed, but probably the investment tax credit does. To reach the goals which have been set by the Biden administration and, so far as I know, will be continued by the Trump administration. Thanks very much, Drew.
Awesome. Just a quick follow-up on the packaging, and I appreciate your laying this out so clearly. R&D, manufacturing, packaging. Where is packaging in terms of U.S. involvement? Is that 30% target a manufacturing target, and where does the U.S. stand on packaging?
No, it's not. It's not a target. The target is 20% of advanced logic and advanced memory chips by 2030. That's what, the Secretary of Commerce said many times in announcing chips. She didn't say anything about packaging. The biggest firm, it's not the only firm, but the biggest firm for packaging, which has gotten a CHIPS Act grant, is SK Hynix, a South Korean firm. And it got a pretty big grant to increase advanced packaging, and it's a very successful firm in that dimension.
All right, we'll come back to this, I'm sure. But now let's go ahead and turn over to Mimi Strobel. Thank you so much for being with us. What's Nokia's perspective on the CHIPS and Science Act?
Sure. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, I'm with Nokia. I'm with our geopolitics and government affairs team, where I do spend a significant amount of my time running our federal grants portfolio, which is mostly, taken over by Chips and Science Act programs. So just a quick background on Nokia. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with our company, but just two notes. First, we did sell our cell phone business. So although many know us for our brick phones of the 90s and the early 2000s, that is no more. We are exclusively an equipment vendor. So we do all of the equipment infrastructure that is responsible for all of our various forms of connectivity. And another important aspect of Nokia I'd like to touch on is the fact that we have Nokia Bell Labs. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Bell Labs, formerly AT&T and later Lucent. And now it is under Nokia. So that is our research and development arm and is, of course, very related to what we're talking about here today. Nokia is a fabless company. We did announce last June our plans to acquire a company which will we will have a fab. That acquisition, it has not been finalized yet, but just a full picture of where Nokia is at with what we're pursuing. And the Chips and Science Act up to this point has been very focused on the research and development piece. Of course, we've been tracking everything with manufacturing, but given that we, don't currently manufacture chips, we haven't been pursuing those grants, of course. So I'll start by just saying that, of course, I echo what my fellow panelists here said, and they did a really amazing job of kind of laying out where everything is at with Chips and Science Act implementation. And today we are focused on chips, but I will just say that the science portion of the bill is certainly lagging. And, with regard to other things like AI and quantum and a whole host of other topics in the R&D space, we would like to see progress on the side of the Science Act. But focusing on chips, I would agree. It was a little bit slow to start. I would think maybe, progress, not perfection, and maybe there was a little bit too much focus on perfection in a lot of ways. And, not a bad thing. Just like Stephen said, appreciate that they're trying to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. But at the end of the day, if we want to meet these pretty aggressive and important goals by 2030, we need to start, getting some of these fabs rolling and some of these R&D programs rolling. So I do think I will just say there's very much a path forward for success for the Chips and Science Act under the new administration. While President Trump has certainly taken a tact of I want to kind of do away with a lot of programs. I would say that it is not the comments that were made about the CHIPS Act specifically. I would say, and I am not these members of Congress or political figures making these comments, but a bit out of pocket. It was just like, yeah, we kind of want to roll back everything, right? I don't think that they really had a full understanding for the CHIPS Act. I see someone already in the chat has made the comment that this bill was created back in 2019. It was originally a CHIPS Act and an Endless Frontiers Act, and eventually became a whole, host of different names and combinations. And this was something that, while it was passed during Biden's administration, the genesis of the bill was started back during Trump's first administration. And I think upon reminding the Trump administration really what the goals of this program are, which are, shoring up U.S. manufacturing, increasing competitiveness in U.S. science and technology. I mean, those are goals that are completely aligned with what President Trump wants. So upon reminding the administration, there might be an initial pause, as there will with, I would say, just about any federal program to, kind of review that program and how the money is being allocated. I think that the CHIPS Act will be one where we see a pretty quick pickup, and let's keep this rolling. This is in line with what we want to be doing. The money is already appropriated. I think we certainly need to appropriate more money. It costs 10 to 20 billion dollars just for the capex to build a fab, and that's not even including the opex. So, I think Intel with their 7, 8 million they got, yes, that absolutely helps a ton. But if we want to meet these goals by 2030, a much larger infusion of cash needs to happen. Certainly, I used to be a congressional staffer. I'm not, naive. Very hard to get that kind of money. So I know that that is something that is absolutely needed, but not something that will be easy to achieve. A second round of an infusion of cash into these types of programs. But I do believe that this is a bipartisan effort where, with the right types of policies and the right types of success from, the current ongoing programs, that we can see another infusion of cash into these CHIPS Act programs, hopefully. I will also note in my introduction, Drew mentioned that I am helping quite a bit with our companies. We joined the National Semiconductor Technology Center. So just for those that aren't familiar, so the NSTC is the sort of flagship R&D program under the CHIPS Act. So there was roughly 40 billion allocated to manufacturing incentives, roughly 10 billion allocated to R&D under the bill. And that 10 billion under the R&D, so half of that is going to NSTC. The other half is going to programs like the National Advanced Packaging and Manufacturing Program. That was actually the program that rolled out the first NOFO for CHIPS R&D. So that was great. They rolled out a second NOFO at the end of last year. I think their concept papers were due before the holidays, so that process is ongoing. With regard to the NSTC, it's a bit of a unique program, and I guess I call it a center since it is the National Semiconductor Technology Center. It is a public-private consortium, so it's not technically run by the Department of Commerce. The Department of Commerce set up what we call NatCast, and NatCast is a nonprofit which is running the NSTC. So there's a lot of benefits to that. One of them being that when you see presidential transitions, this program was meant to, continue running as is without, a huge amount of political influence. It's very targeted and specific in its goals. So they opened up membership at the end of last year. Nokia, as well as many other companies in the ecosystem, have joined. This week and last week, they started their kickoff focus group calls where they're starting to, get more member input about what we would like to see the focus of the NSTC be this year. And with NSC membership, it certainly grants will be a part of that. And that will definitely help because, I can tell you right now, Nokia has three really solid and even more, beyond those three, really solid proposals that are, like leapfrog technologies that really would, things that when we're talking about competing with China, like no one else is the United States is doing this type of research. Only China is. So, someone in the US needs to be driving this. And so that a lot of really amazing research is happening at Nokia Bell Labs and at, Nokia within our other business groups as well. So grant programs to fund specific projects will certainly be part of NSTC membership. But another big part of it is really ecosystem collaboration, access to facilities. So the NSTC itself will have 3 facilities. They're all on the NatCast website. Happy to talk more about them if there's interest, but they're all on the NatCast website. And access to those facilities as well as a lot of ecosystem collaboration opportunities, which, of course, there's always kind of the proprietary concerns when you're talking about these things, but, a lot of these ideas, they happen in a collaborative environment anyway. Like when you're in the research and development phase, the more the merrier. We want more smart people from different places in the same room, making these things come from beginning to end. We're in the research and development phase, and in order to get it into act from research to actual development, it's tough. And I know one of the questions posed with this briefing was, are there any gaps? I know that there is a pretty significant gap with regard to like this concept of lab to fab and being able to take something from the lab to the fab. So that's certainly something that we're focused on. Gary talked about there's R&D, there's manufacturing, and then there's the assembling, testing, and packaging, and those are all three important tenets. And in order to reach the goals that all of us, including the federal government, would like to reach by 2030, you really need leadership in all three. So we are very focused on manufacturing is incredibly important, but just given our fabless but very research heavy company, we have been very focused on the R&D side of this, and it is equally as important as the other tenets. So I will stop there and look forward to a continued good discussion here.
Very good, very good. Well, listen, a lot of topics teed up here. Just a quick question for maybe Mimi to kick off, but others could weigh in too. So CHIPS and Science Act. So like, could you just quickly describe what the science pieces are versus the CHIPS pieces? Again, Mimi, but if others want to weigh in on that quickly.
Sure. Yeah, I can do it quick too. The CHIPS Act is, just what we're talking about today, the CHIPS manufacturing and the R&D programs. The Science Act included a ton of things, but I would say the big thing it included was the brand new NSF science, or what was it? The Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate, the TIP Directorate. That has been slow to take off. And really what that NSF typically does not do much private sector work or grants. It's much more like academia focused. The TIP Directorate would be a more industry, public, private, and academia, like consortium type focus. And they have 10 key focus areas, and they're all like essentially emerging science and technology areas. So, like next generation connectivity, more like a more secure grid, AI, quantum, advanced manufacturing. So it's, of course, there are, I think, like biomedical topics are in there as well, but I'm not as involved with that, so I don't know a ton. But yes, there are telecommunications research areas, but it's 10 key focus areas kind of across industries. And that there are other programs under the Science Act, but that one was really the key one that was going to be a difference maker under that act that we really have not seen come to fruition. And it is largely because it's been underfunded in appropriations bills.
So I want to go back. Go ahead, please jump in.
Can I add
a
few words on that?
Steve first.
The Science Act authorized $200 billion in congressional funding for science and R&D from FY23 to FY27, including $61 billion specifically for the National Science Foundation over that time period, other funding initiatives at like DOE Office of Science, NIST, et cetera. Unfortunately, as Mimi said, the congressional authorizations from the CHIPS Act since then, or the Science Act since then, have come in about 8 to 11%, what was below authorization. So in time, it seemed like a transformative generational investment in science, and unfortunately, we haven't seen that level of funding coming through in congressional science authorization since then.
And just for those who don't follow Washington extremely closely, you almost everything that's spent by the government really needs to be spent twice, authorized and then appropriate. And so it's kind of like you got to have the authorization, but then you also need the appropriation in order to have that money spent. So these numbers can be very, very different, the authorization and appropriation, although that's probably as big as I've ever seen, an 8% of the authorized amount being appropriated. Gary, what else would you add to this topic?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. What I would add is that there's only been one tremendously successful government research enterprise, and that's DARPA, run out of the Pentagon. And I won't go into the details of how it's run, but it totally insulated from political influence, bringing brilliant people to award grants and so forth. The Sciences Act part of the CHIPS and Sciences Act, yeah, it's a big bundle of authorized money. What will eventually be appropriated, who knows? It might be only a small amount. And it's not at all clear at this stage that the DARPA model will be followed. So I put a big question mark on this. The other thing I would mention is that Mimi did a great job of explaining what's gone on under the CHIPS Act, its research program, which, as she said, totals about 11 billion. Of about half of that, 5 billion is this new technology center. When we wrote our report, we couldn't find out who the private members are. Maybe they've been disclosed now. I don't know. But what I want to tell this conversation this morning is that 5 billion is not much money for what we're talking about. I mean, you look at the research budgets of Qualcomm, Broadcom, NVIDIA, ASML. I mean, 5 billion is a drop in the bucket. Now, it may be tremendously well spent, maybe not. We had one big experiment in kind of private company cooperation with some government contribution in the semiconductor industry. And that was decades ago in the Reagan administration, called Semitech. We've evaluated that. Just the thumbnail evaluation is it was not a great success. So I'm holding my breath on this new center, both because I don't think the money is adequate and I don't think the cooperation will necessarily work. What I would much prefer is money to be given by tax credits for R&D to companies. I've already said that. I'll just repeat that. Thanks, Drew.
Well, and we may want to drill into the grants and loans versus tax credits too, but we're getting some questions, and I do think it's worth tackling these that Don Albert's been raising about. He's saying, from the Financial Times, Trump halts disbursement of funds appropriated under infrastructure and IRA. So I just want to kind of clarify a little bit here. This is based on our reporting, and Broadband Breakfast reported on Monday about the energy provisions and the halts of IRA spent or IRA appropriated funds. At least I think that's correct, appropriated funds. But what I do want to clarify is that even though that executive order does have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act listed, we have reporting that will be posted on Broadband Breakfast very shortly that there's some further guidance from the Trump White House clarifying that non-energy projects are not covered by that executive order. So in other words, BEAD projects have not been halted under the executive orders of the Trump administration. And there's no mention that we've been able to find of CHIPS Act being, halted. So just kind of breaking news, so to speak, to clarify and address this question that Dan has been raising. Now, all that said, there's a further wrinkle in federal funding, right? We've talked about authorized and appropriated, but then there's obligated, okay? And what money has been obligated is kind of regarded as not pullable back, cannot be pulled back, right? Whereas appropriated funds have occasionally been pulled back. Stephen, do you want to weigh in on this, on the appropriated versus obligated distinction?
Yes. This gets arcane legally between congressional and presidential powers over what a president can do with funds that have been duly appropriated by the legislative branch. And in general, the history comes down that if money has been obligated yet not disbursed yet, that a president cannot go back and either resize or impound that money. In my view, this is why the Inflation Reduction Act is a much bigger target than CHIPS, because they're looking hundreds of billions of dollars, and some degree of that, especially for the out years of the funding, like up to FY 2027, have clearly not been even authorized yet. So I think if the president is interested in seriously considering trying to relitigate what Congress has done, he'll look at RA and not CHIPS. But I think there's one important piece of history here, and I want to stress this is Stephen Ezel's view of the geopolitical world. My read on the situation is that in 2016, when he came into the office first time, he said, you know, we have a lot of security commitments around the world. One of those is Taiwan. Their largest chip maker really should have a fab in the United States. So he dispatched Wilbur Ross and the team at Commerce to go prevail upon our Taiwanese friends to open the fab. And I think what happened was Morris Chang said, sure, we'll do it. But the reality is it costs 30% more to do a fab in the United States than it does in Taiwan. You close a 30% cost differential, we're happy to do it. That's where chips came from. They went to Cornyn, they went to Warner, Blackburn, and the team in the Senate, as was pointed out, Republicans in the Senate with Warner and Schumer wrote chips. We got the CHIPS Act, right? So the notion that chips is a particular target of Trump in his second term, I don't buy into personally, because I think a lot of the thinking for this actually came from Trump himself in the first place.
Yeah, no, that's a great perspective. How this also intersects with the Buy America provisions, though, is something I think it's worth touching on. Mimi, of course, I've talked with a number of your colleagues at Nokia a lot over this provision, and you've pointed out that while Nokia may be a fabulous company, it's not a fabless company, and so, or it is a fabless company. So what is the way that the things you do make, you know, like all of the optical equipment, kind of fit into this perspective of semiconductors and advanced equipment for whether it's processing or communications? That's clearly something that you're in the space of. So could you just clarify that a little bit, Mimi?
Sure. So I will take this opportunity to highlight that Nokia, under the BEAD program, which had, you know, the Buy America restrictions, or it was strictly applied to the Buy America was strictly applied to the BEAD program. So Nokia was the first company to announce onshoring of our manufacturing of optical components to be in compliance with Buy America for the BEAD program specifically. So those, you know, those goals of onshoring manufacturing are really very closely aligned, of course. I mean, they're really running parallel to each other with the CHIPS Act. There's you can't necessarily apply Buy America to this because you're giving people money to onshore their manufacturing. In other cases, I mean, we weren't giving any money by the federal government to make those onshoring decisions for the BEAD program. So there is a difference there, but the goals are the same. Over the past 30 years, manufacturing on US soil has moved elsewhere. How do we move that manufacturing back to the United States? It goes without saying that it is not as cost effective to manufacture here. So how do we build in incentives to help offset some of those increased costs? Like Gary has said, tax credits. You know, we've talked a lot about grants. There's, you know, ways that we can get creative with it, and also ways that we can make it more doable. Like Stephen was saying at the beginning, it's already hard enough to onshore manufacturing. It's even more difficult when you have, like, I absolutely see the desire to do workforce and environmental protections and just added requirements in those types of spaces. But adding on these kind of ancillary requirements, it really does not help incentivize companies to want to onshore. And that is regardless of whether or not you're getting a grant to help you with that onshoring. So I would say that the goals of Buy America and the goals of the CHIPS Act absolutely are the same, and they run parallel. But Buy America is not necessarily applied to the CHIPS Act.
Stephen, let's
Drew,
talk for.
can I add a point?
Go ahead, Gary, please.
Yeah, I think a commendable feature of the CHIPS Act is that it is very welcoming to foreign firms, and foreign firms are absolutely critical to this manufacturing. So what am I
Non-Chinese foreign firms.
I'm talking about TSMC, the big Taiwan semiconductor firm, Samsung, the big South Korean firm, and SK Hynix, the big South Korean firm. And all of them have gotten CHIPS Act grants, and that's really important. And as Mimi said, I mean, Nokia is a tremendous player in this space as well. And so I really endorse that aspect. There's another foreign firm I want to mention again. I mentioned before, ASML. That's the Dutch firm which manufactures these huge extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. And these are $300 million a copy. It's not the only firm in this space. There are other firms as well. As far as I know, the U.S. has not given any grants or incentives for ASML to produce in the United States. Maybe Stephen will correct me on that. But this welcoming of foreign firms into production here has got to be it's really a very enlightened aspect of the CHIPS Act.
Well, that's great. And Stephen, if you want to say anything on that or weigh in on like where the lithography factors in the R&D, the manufacturing and the packaging, I'd love to hear more on that. But I do want to drill in on the numbers of expenditures and the way you laid it out at the beginning, Stephen, I was like, I had thought the numbers were higher. I mean, if it's basically 49 billion and 11 billion in loans, 50 billion. I mean, yes, the tax credit is 100 billion. That's still only 150 billion. I mean, that seems very economical relative to the stated goals of it. Could you just kind of confirm that and maybe speak to are there looming potentials if it's like way more successful than people think? Will it actually cost more tax revenues and tax credits?
Well, I do think this has been one of the successes of this piece of legislation. According to the CHIPS Program Office, they have catalyzed more than $10 of private sector investment for every dollar of government investment. So the additionality impact here has been very significant. The CBO initially scored the ITC at $24 billion. I think Gary exactly pointed out that's going to come in at a much higher level. So, yeah. By the way, the newest semiconductor fabs are upward of $30 billion. What TSMC is building in Taiwan, coming down to the sub 2 nanometer 1.7 process node. So, for all the conversation that these are, Intel sent a letter. Senator Rick Scott of Florida sent a letter to then CEO Gelsinger of Intel. Saying, why'd you lay off 15% of your workforce when you're going to get $8 billion from us? And as Gary has pointed out, that's not a lot of money. At most, any of these loans or incentives is going to be offsetting 5 to 15% of the actual investment cost of any given fab. And that was one reason we pointed out maybe the CBO was being the CHIPS Program Office was being a little over aggressive because these companies are not going to undertake multi-billion-dollar investments where the federal money is at most 5 to 15% if they're not very confident that these are going to succeed. So as I say. I think the most important factor is let's get this money out to the companies. Let's get it dispersed. Let's build these fabs. Let's have the effect that we want from these things. Let's get to that 20% level by 2030 of the world's most sophisticated chips. And for the moment, focus on effective execution and implementation of this program.
Well, let's talk in the remaining 5 minutes we've got, and we'll give every one of you a chance to give quick closing statements too. But why has it taken so long? And I mean the everything bagel that you mentioned, Stephen, right? But also like what could be changed or tweaked either by the Trump administration or by Congress, kind of coming back and revisiting it to make it better, to make if there's a kind of agreement, alignment. Yes, this is meeting the administration's priorities. How could it be improved? Let's hear from each of you, Mimi and Gary first.
Sure. Well, I would echo what I said earlier. While I realize it is a tall order, another infusion of cash, I understand that we need to make sure that the dollars that have already been appropriated go through when we see success with those. But infusion of cash for sure. It goes without saying that, where we're allocating 50 billion, China's allocating 50 billion a year. So, and that's not a statistic, I'm just for scale
Yeah.
saying that. Um, so certainly another infusion of cash, and we've all talked about this, but add-on policies like the tax credits, reductive policies like taking out some of the extraneous requirements. And I would say just hard to make this as a thing, but everyone has to do their part in this equation and see the value and understand like kind of those three tenets of R&D, manufacturing, and the assembly, testing, and packaging. So ultimately, it needs to, if the CHIPS and Science Act passes and nothing follows, long term, that we're
Yeah.
not going to see the results we want. So I just suggested what I think would be some, obvious things to do. But regardless of what we do, there has to be follow-on policies and funding made to support these programs.
Let's give everyone else a chance to, but anything else you would want to add in conclusion, maybe before we
That's
go
all.
to, okay,
Okay.
great. Gary, that question and anything else you'd like to add before we
Okay, thanks, Drew. Thanks for running this program. Very interesting and educational. I would say just a couple of points. For any money given by the government for R&D in this area, and there have been some questions about optical and so forth, my big suggestion is give that pot of money to DARPA in the Pentagon, because this is all about national security. That was the big selling point of the CHIPS Act. DARPA does national security very, very well. Give them billions of dollars if you're going to give it through the government. Secondly, give research R&D tax credits to companies so that they do it on their own. And that would be a big improvement. I think that passing out grants through the Department of Commerce, even with the best intention people, everyone's afraid that they're going to give money to some company and there's going to be some corruption and it's going to come back. Why didn't you have some obligation or whatever that prevented that? So, hey, your reputation is destroyed. So I don't think that's a very effective way of channeling future money. What's been spent, that's water under the bridge. Thanks, Boo.
All right, Stephen, we're going to give you the last word to answer that question. Say anything else that you'd like to add from this discussion.
Well, agree with Mimi. Let's strip out the extraneous requirements from these funding packages that are about social engineering and not laser focused on U.S. competitiveness. But two other important points. One, we face a 67,000 person semiconductor professionals gap by the end of this decade. So if we're really going to build all these fabs, we're going to need to expand semiconductor engineering education programs across U.S. colleges. Arizona State just launched a nice program, but let's be mindful that we have to have an educated workforce with the skills to produce these fabs. Also, again, let's look at policies impacting America's semiconductor sector holistically. Because if you have had a chance to take a look at the Biden administration export control framework for artificial intelligence diffusion executive order, which came out just a couple of weeks ago, what it essentially says is that no more than 50% of the GPUs made in America can be exported to foreign countries. Now, people argue over that math. That's essentially what it says. So why are we giving to the sector with one hand and then taking away the ability to export these products to global markets on the other hand? That's a concern. We need to relook at that diffusion framework here in the Trump administration. But again, it's not just about giving these companies money to build the fabs. It's about ensuring that we're fashioning global markets so our companies can responsibly sell their product to nations around the world.
Boy, you've raised a whole new issue for us to talk about because, I guess I view that as like, make sure that the bad guys don't get access to the top processors. But you're making the point about manufacturer-driven exports. Well, listen, great discussion. Thank you so much for being with us. We are here again next Wednesday at this time to talk about the Little Tech Agenda. And we're here every week, every Wednesday at 12 noon. Thank you for being a part of this discussion. Our panelists, Stephen Izell, Gary Huffbauer, and Mimi Strobel. Thank you again, and we'll see you next week.